Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And I'm joined today by Amy. Amy, can you please share a little bit about yourself and tell folks about what you do?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. My name is Amy Loomis. I am Research Vice President of the Future of Work at IDC. I've been doing this for about 6 years, and I focus on the transformation journeys that our clients are taking and how that is evolving with new technologies.
Talking about new technologies, where are your clients currently on generative AI adoption? Tell me about that.
Sure. So we have a real mix of
Mhm,
adoption. And when you talk about generative AI, I think it is one of those things that people need to get much more specific about. So
mhm,
on the one hand, you have generative AI capabilities that are around assistance, helping somebody to do a
mhm,
repetitive task and being uh, able to take on the responsibilities of finding information, for example. In that instance, we see a big growth just between 2023 and 2024 alone. We
mm,
saw a jump between 35% to 61%
mm,
of organizations responding to our surveys that were looking at applying Gen AI. That said, when you get a little bit more specific into the different types of
mhm,
generative AI, you move to the right essentially from pure play assistants to being able to have AI advisors. And then now the discussion is all around agentic AI
mm,
and how agents are taking a role. In that instance where you have a fully autonomous or a somewhat autonomous
mhm,
algorithm that is performing a workflow, we see the numbers much lower. So
mm,
in that instance, it's roughly about 20% that we see responding to our surveys that say they are already using this technology,
mhm,
and about 28% on average. These are global surveys that are being done. That they're about 28% are using it in a few specialized areas, and then
mhm,
conducting initial POCs. Again, another about a quarter. The exception here is in Asia Pacific, where those numbers are much higher, closer to
mhm,
41% that are either using
mm.
it in specialized areas or conducting initial POCs. So I that's a quick answer, and I'm
Yeah.
happy to dive into some of the details if you'd like.
Why do you think folks in the Asia Pacific are much more ahead?
Well, I think that this has been a journey that they've been pursuing very actively all along.
Hmm.
I think that it's not a surprise when it comes to some of the AI adoption. It's consistent with what we've seen for a
Mhm,
long period of time. Within the context of future of work, there is, I think, a greater uniformity of work processes that will lend themselves to working with Gen AI and agentic AI in particular. I have
mhm,
colleagues who are very well versed in doing a lot of in-depth research on this. But pervasively, whether you're talking about Asia Pacific or Western Europe or the United States and Canada, one of the biggest challenges to why this isn't happening even more quickly has to do with the challenge of finding people with the right skill sets.
mm,
And it's a bit of an irony that on the one hand, there's so much push for productivity and use of Gen
mhm,
AI to drive that productivity. On the other hand, one of the dependencies for the productivity being realized is investment in skills and IT skills in particular.
mm,
And so I think where you've got a mindset of continuous growth, of investment in skills development, and a
mhm,
focus on those
mhm,
things, you're going to see rapid acceleration of deployment and shift from POC to execution. Where you don't see the concurrent investment in skills development, there's going to be a bit
mm,
of a drag on that adoption. Even if the tools are exceptional, you still need people to work with them.
mm. Fair enough. Let's talk about skills development. What have you seen as the best practices in skills development?
I think there are a couple. We're used to thinking of that as an isolated activity, if you will. So I do my work and plus one, I develop my skills. That's no longer a luxury that I think most
Mm.
organizations can afford. We're seeing increased adoption of technologies like digital adoption platforms or
Mhm.
Gen AI that will mimic some of the characteristics of that by providing interactive workflows and prompts
Mm.
for people to learn how to go from step A to B to C. That embedded learning in the flow of work at the browser level, not necessarily at
Mhm.
the application level, is a really useful way of getting people up to speed.
Mhm.
That said, I think there are a lot of very good complements to that, which are discrete. So yes, you see micro learning being
Mhm.
part of a standardized curriculum. I think experiential learning and using things like AR and VR to be able to replicate particular use
Mm.
cases is helpful. And as we collect more metadata on how people are interacting with these applications and with Gen AI workflows, it will
Mhm.
become increasingly easy to understand where the gaps are. Um, and I want to point out, I think this is important, that the gaps are not simply gaps in technical expertise. It used to be, oh, my kingdom for a C# developer, right?
Mhm.
Or a full stack Java developer. That is less the case now than it used to be because what's really required is aptitude to learn rather
Mm.
than expertise in a specific area alone. So, to the extent that people have the capacity to be flexible enough with going across disciplines,
Mhm.
being able to understand how their insights into human behavior can translate into, say, prompt engineering for, machine learning or
Mhm.
for Gen AI is a skill in and of itself that isn't, and this is my big pet peeve, is people who use the word soft skills. I think these are human
Mhm.
skills that are only going to become amplified with Gen AI adoption rather than put at the back of the train in the caboose.
So let's think about how a company might actually encourage its employees to develop these skills. If we can think about, let's say, a mid-sized manufacturing company, just to take an example. What would they concretely do to help their employees develop skills in generative AI? So they have employees who are obviously some people on the factory floor, obviously some people on the back end operations, some people in marketing and sales. What would they do? Like, what would it look like?
So I think you have to begin by doing an assessment of where your skills development approach is at the moment. So for a
Hmm.
lot of organizations, they may have, say, a subscription with LinkedIn, or they may be looking at, coding opportunities to do experiential learning with
Hmm.
GitHub. Um, that kind of thing is typically either isolated within a particular function or line of business. You think about accreditation as people become, more and more expert in things like, say, HR or finance, right?
Hmm.
So much of it is fragmented. So for that mid-sized manufacturing organization, I think understanding what are the core essential skills that are going to be enduring, that every single person from the factory floor to the C-suite really needs to understand.
Hmm.
And it's not that the, content is going to be identical, though in some instances around, say, corporate values or procedures, then yes, the procedure is the procedure. But I think the assessment of where there is the highest gap between the desired outcome and the skills that your current employees have is sort of step one. Step two, I think, is to be able to right size the learning to be adaptable into the flow of work. Telling somebody that is on a set schedule that they need to go and take an hour-long training and it's only going to put them behind by an hour in their quota that they have to meet within a workday isn't going to work.
Hmm.
So I think determining how to right size and create micro learning for people so that they can consume it consistently and at scale
Hmm.
is a really important part of that process as well. I think a third thing that's really important is to look at how are you going to do forms of blended learning. So it's not
Okay.
like you're throwing out your LXPs or your learning management platforms, but you're augmenting them with things like digital learning, with things
Hmm.
like micro learning and experiential learning from peers. So that person who's
Hmm.
working on the front line in manufacturing may someday wind up being a product management person if their engagement with the company is part of a unified platform where everybody gets a common experience. So there's going to be discrete learning for people who are deeply, expert in, say, material science, and there's going to
Hmm.
be process learning for people who are doing more manual tasks, and there's going to be executive leadership. Those are different things.
Sure.
But to the extent that they can be unified in a common platform where
Hmm.
people can look at peer, pathways to growth, I think that's really important. And to the extent that you've got an HR function that's aware of what some of those career pathways might be, there's a lot of opportunity for upskilling internally in addition to looking externally to get people those kinds of skills. So
Hmm.
ultimately, why would you do the learning is to keep your organizational healthy, to keep it evolving like a fish that needs to swim to stay alive.
Yeah.
I think it's in that vein that you have a real diaspora of different approaches and that you right size the combination to fit the needs of the business and the needs of the individual workers.
Okay. So something that you haven't talked about yet, and I observed, so I've working with a number of companies to help them integrate generative AI, I've observed that an obstacle to learning is occasionally resistance from employees who have a lot of anxiety about job replacement and
Mm.
anxiety about learning these newfangled tools. And I'm curious, what have you seen as effective ways of overcoming the kind of resistance that's associated with generative AI, which is much bigger than with previous digital transformations, because it's not simply you change your processes, but with this tool that might potentially replace your job. And we do have a number of headlines about companies that have replaced a number of people with generative AI tools. Also, generative AI has a lot more customization requirements where you need to figure out the appropriate use cases for each function in a way that's different for typical digital transformation projects where they're more standardized and you don't have to figure out as much of a customized use case for different functions. So there's both more of an effort to adapt generative AI to the needs of each company and also more anxiety about generative AI as a tool.
Yeah, I think and those are essentially two different questions. I think they're
Yeah.
complementary, but let me tackle the first one, which is
Hmm.
essentially how do you assuage people who have fears?
Yeah.
I think you have to, I don't like using war metaphors, but in this instance, if you consider it a battle, you have to pick your battles, right? Um,
Hmm.
and what I mean by that is the following. I had a conversation earlier in the year with the CIO. That CIO had a small team and wanted to upskill some of his Java developers. He was struggling because he just didn't have enough of the talent that he needed in the right places. So, you
Hmm.
know, the issue that he confronted were people who had been in the business for decades. They, were probably between 2 and 5 years away from retirement. And the
Hmm.
concern was that they would appear less of an expert. And
Hmm.
so there's a social science to this.
Yeah.
There's an element of appealing to people's sense of identity at the end of their careers where they need to feel a sense of accomplishment, not like, shoots and ladders game where you're starting the whole game
Hmm.
all over again,
Yeah.
which is what contributes to people's fear. They don't want to look unsuccessful. They don't want to
Hmm.
look like a noob. And I fully recognize that that's a legitimate concern. So what to do in that instance, right? You have an opportunity to perhaps have them mentor other people. In this case, it wasn't a question of, well, we're going in this direction, you're either on the bus or you're not. There are plenty of people who are minding legacy systems that require the same skills. I mean,
Hmm.
if you look at the federal government systems that are built on COBOL, right?
Sure.
That's an equally important concern because it's not just we can't get old dogs to learn new tricks. We also need people to, continue to mine those
Mhm.
systems, and the value that is placed on people who have that expertise is not insignificant, right? So why would I, as somebody who's deeply experienced and whose expertise is valued, in some way compromise that? So I think to acknowledge
Mhm.
where those instances are where forcing someone into a new way of working or learning is not going to bring the value that you need is,
Mhm.
a matter of fact way to handle it. That said, there are many people who are very eager to learn about AI and Gen AI
Mhm.
and agentic AI, and to nurture and coax and provide means by which those people can do it, I think is very important. And the
Mhm.
challenge that I've seen here is it's not simply that they don't, they aren't coaxable or willing to learn new things. It's that the system that they are working in is not designed to help them do that. They need
Mhm.
to learn on their lunch hour. They need to learn off the
Mhm.
clock. This is what I meant earlier about there being
Yeah.
two, these things are discrete and they need to be integrated. So I
Mhm.
think the answer to your first question is that there are many ways to bring people on board through mentorship and through finding integrated means of evolving what they do rather than saying, well, we're
Mhm.
no longer doing it the old way and now we're doing it
Mhm.
the new way. It's a matter of, help me to understand the right way to get you from point A to point B. Here's the desired
Mhm.
outcome. Let's talk about how we get there and what these tools can help you to accomplish. And I think
Mhm.
putting it in the context of somebody's career growth in terms of improvements to the quality of their work. And I think very
Mhm.
importantly to acknowledge that this may not be easy. It may be a two steps back to take one step forward
Mhm.
situation, and that is okay. You have to create that culture of learning. I'm
Mhm.
not so glib as to say fail fast forward, but I
Mhm.
do think that that element of, experimentation, understanding, learning, companionship as part of the equation is going to go a long way towards smoothing the rough edges. We are
Mhm.
all learning. In other words, it's not here's the new way, learn it or get lost, right?
Mhm.
So that's sort of the first part. Now,
Okay.
the second part that you were talking about, that's much more of I think a challenge in a different way. And I was
Mhm.
wondering if you could repeat a little bit of the question because I got so involved in the first question, I wanted to make sure I did justice to the second half.
Sure. Your answer to the first one was great. So my second question was that generative AI is different than previous technologies. Whether
All
you're
right.
adopting something like Salesforce or an ERP, it's a much more standardized tool. There are much more standardized use cases. With generative AI, it's much more customized to each individual role and function, and it's evolving very quickly. And so the new things that we can do with generative AI are going to be very new and different. Things that you think didn't work 6 months ago are going to be working now. Things that don't work now will work for 6 months from now. So there are a lot of different ways to use generative AI, and each person in a company needs to figure out how it fits into their role. And that's much more difficult than a typical digital transformation project. So people need to be much more invested and have a lot more buy-in. And that I was making the comparison that given the existing fears and anxieties about generative AI, that's much more difficult to do because of those pre-existing fears and anxieties, which are different and distinct than the already lots of change management headache that comes with a typical digital transformation project.
Yeah, and I think this is a you don't know what you don't know
Mhm.
situation. And I'll give you some examples. So, I was just at our IDC CMO executive council meeting, and it was quite refreshing to see that many of the people in the room had spent the last 2 years doing the hard work of that transformation.
Mhm.
And for example, in the marketing organization, traditionally you might have a division that was dedicated towards, say, advertising, and a subgroup that was oriented towards events, and another group that
Mhm.
was oriented towards content creation, and so on and so forth. And in the adoption of generative AI, what people need to understand is that this isn't just a journey in technology adoption. This is a journey in change management.
Yep.
Because, as you're looking at where the data sources are and the metadata against them, you might start out with systems of record where it's
Mhm.
easy to say, well, we have a DAM, a digital archive of materials that is looking at, it's for digital asset management. That's the acronym. But you're looking at where all of these images are stored and all of the
Mhm.
metadata that goes against them. Now imagine that you can simply do a prompt where you describe what you want. I want to see Amy riding a bicycle in France with a, glass of wine, um, and do that for Germany and do that for Sweden, right? That can be done in a matter of minutes as opposed to searching
Mhm.
for a long period of time to find just the right image for the advertisement, that kind of thing. And so my point is that in that example for marketing, it wasn't simply a matter of updating the technology and teaching people prompt engineering.
Mhm.
The company I'm thinking of went through a series of reorganizational efforts where they test drove, well, where are our governance people going to report? Are they going to report into legal? Where are we going
Mhm.
to are we going to combine certain functions? Is events something that goes under our message creation, or is events its
Mhm.
own um, part of the organization that has other elements that are under it? So it's a bit of shuffling of the deck to
Mhm.
find the right combination of organizational connection points and resources,
Mhm.
and frankly, innate skills that gel well together.
Mhm.
And that I think is going to be much like your description of the manufacturer example. That's going to vary by organization, not just necessarily by function. Some functions are,
Mhm.
well established to collaborate regardless of who you put where, and others not so much. So
Mhm.
understanding that this is what that is about. So that may be the necessary 2 year journey for marketing. It may be that in finance, that adoption of generative AI tools are
Mhm.
much less of a card shuffle, if you will extend the metaphor. If you're dealing with the systems of record and you're dealing with, regulations that are very standardized.
Mhm.
And I'm not trying to paint, finance or procurement as utterly rigid, but
Mhm.
the systems that they work with are much more deterministic. And the whole
Mhm.
point of AI is that it's non-deterministic. So,
Yeah.
unlike being able to describe an ad campaign and be very fanciful and imaginative, I don't think people are so keen to have the folks be fanciful and imaginative with the books. So
Mhm.
I think that different functions will have a different learning curve and an organizational transformation pace based
Mhm.
on the degree to which they are fully invested in the non-deterministic capabilities, the learning functions, the
Mhm.
creative functions that Gen AI offers. So it's more along those lines of, high context or low context work. The lower the context, the more it is mechanical. The higher the
Mhm.
context, the more it's going to be fluid and less predictable. So I think that's really the watchwords for how you customize it is A, no matter what end of that spectrum you're on, you look at
Mhm.
it as a joint organizational and technical transformation that
Mhm.
is innately dependent upon new skills, new ways of thinking about job roles, and then it will vary, mileage will vary even within the same company, depending on the degree to which something is very structured and rigidly defined, or the degree to which the task and the work and the function is much more creative and
Mhm.
frankly humanly defined.
Talks about creativity and innovation. What about risk management? So there are
Mm.
lots of risks associated with generative AI. There are data privacy risks. There are security risks from things like prompt injection and jailbreaking. There's compliance and risks, and there's legal risks. There's PR risks. There's hallucination,
Other than
misinformation.
that,
There's
it's
bias.
awesome.
So there's a lot of risks. There's even potentially existential risks from AI losing control in the long term. But we're talking about like short-term business concerns. How should businesses think about how are businesses thinking about and addressing it? What are you seeing?
Well, I mean, I'll preface what I'm about to say by saying that I am not a security expert, and we have many
Hmm.
who are at IDC. But from my perspective, looking at different use cases, talking to CIOs, talking to
Hmm. Hmm.
CAIOs, the risks in some instances are on paper far greater than the behaviors of people who are exploring the use of Gen AI. In other words, you'd think it would be much more of an inhibitor than it is. And organizations are moving forward. They
Hmm.
are experimenting. It may be within the context of walled gardens. It may be within the
Hmm.
context of very, specific, more deterministic data sets and such.
Hmm.
But nevertheless, they're persisting, partially out of fear of missing out, and partially
Hmm.
because the temptation of productivity that's promised is far greater than anything that they can say no to, and they're willing to take the risk. Now,
Hmm.
that said, there are some very concrete ways in which that risk can be mitigated. Of course, you look at where is the data. Do you have it on-prem? Being very careful not to share sensitive data out to
Hmm.
LLMs that are public, um, making sure that the deployment of Gen AI tools is something that's governed carefully.
Hmm.
And that governance goes from pure play, technical restrictions that are preventative, so there's a human in the loop and ultimately on the loop if you
Hmm.
trust the growth pattern, the generative pattern that is emerging, and you have sufficient precautions in play to cross-check it. But
Hmm.
you can, it's on a simple end of the spectrum, add in those human intervention points. And at the other end of the agentic spectrum, being sure that you can essentially have safeguards that they themselves can be automated, right? So,
Hmm.
you can use it's like AI for good, essentially, and
Hmm.
insofar as that you have the policing capabilities that are automated to ensure that if there is a pattern disruption, that it gets flagged,
Hmm.
that there are means of auto pause, if you will,
Hmm.
to restrict what would be the normal flow of work. And it may be it's a better flow,
Hmm.
but if it goes outside certain parameters, then you've got the automated essentially off switch or clip level
Hmm.
to be able to trigger that. The other element of it has to do with the biggest risk typically in traditional security conversations are the humans, the degree to
Sure.
which you can trust people to be doing the right thing and none of this is necessarily, not none, but it does not necessarily have to be nefarious. People can
Hmm.
make innocent mistakes that have very major consequences. So, I mean, we did a quick poll of CIOs, and the top concern that they had in terms of requiring investment is AI model training and deployment and data quality and governance. Those two
Hmm.
things, if you get those right, you're mitigating the risk. Security and compliance also right up there in the top three. That's data location. How do you enforce the policies? How
Hmm.
do you have um, the right integrations in place and zero tolerance on some of these, and
Hmm.
that involves some of the training. And some of it is automated and some of it is organic, for lack of a better way to put
Mm.
it.
Now, we talked about structure, but we didn't talk about governance. Can you tell me a little bit more about best practices for generative AI governance?
So I think that varies by organization.
Hmm.
I will just share one best practice
Yeah.
that I thought was fairly wise in this regard. There are a couple steps here, but from a leadership standpoint, if you've got an organization that's eager to experiment with Gen AI, you've got to have a handle on what's going on. It can't be just a whole series of skunk works that are
Hmm.
going on everywhere, and not knowing who's bought which product and being served in what to what
Hmm.
end,
Hmm.
right? So I would say there needs to be simultaneously fairly rigid constructs from a governance standpoint
Hmm.
that say these are the parameters of which vendors you can use in this current time period, and then you set that time period. And also from the other from a vending perspective, you have to have certain, IT service management protocols to ensure that you don't have other tools that are being implemented, certainly not in your day-to-day work and client-facing
Hmm.
work. Um, and I think that from the opposite end of the spectrum, you may lock down that aspect of it and have it be fairly rigid,
Hmm.
but you also need to have a mechanism by which people who want to propose use of a new tool, that there is a process. Maybe
Hmm.
there's a weekly nomination process
Hmm.
where people bring forth their ideas for a new tool or a new capability that can be evaluated. It might
Hmm.
get put on the short list of what would be the next set of things to deploy. So you need to have an outlet for people's creative ideas and their ingenuity, and you also need to make sure that this isn't just innovation for its own
Hmm.
sake. So, just because you can automate something doesn't mean you should. You might do a bad process much faster. So
Hmm.
it's the old joke about that. But I think in that instance, the governance needs to be governance of innovation as well as governance of deployment. And then the other thing that I'm hearing from a governance standpoint that's been going fairly well is bring together a cross-disciplinary
Hmm.
group of executives and contributors around a center of excellence. And that center of excellence is going to evaluate, reevaluate, craft, and fine-tune what the governance around AI and Gen AI should be. So it's meant to be a means and measure by which people who are very well versed in the culture of different functions and in the culture of the
Hmm.
company can come together and assess what will work and be most effective. So, for example, do we make something a requirement with zero exception? Do we put in place something that is a guideline versus a hard guardrail? To what is the language that we use around this? Do we make it a hard and fast rule and requirement? Do we make it something that's strongly recommended? How do we do enforcement? And that's got to fit into the
Hmm.
company culture. That's got to be part of quote unquote how we do things. So I think the
Hmm.
government governance aspect of it follows both the rules of traditional governance that you see for other technologies, but
Hmm.
also requires its own center of excellence because exactly as you said before, this is very different than other technology deployments insofar as it's continuously changing and growing. It's not like you said it and done.
Hmm. Absolutely. Now, this has been very helpful. As we finish up, what is your vision of what will the next couple of years with generative AI integration look like?
That's a great question. And we've been thinking about this a lot. I mean, I think that in the
Mhm.
in the next 6 to 12 months, we're going to see, first off, on the governance point, there's going to be new job roles that are becoming more and more common. So right now,
Mhm.
the number of chief AI officers is fairly discrete. I would say under
Mhm.
20%. But there will be emerging roles, whether they are part of existing roles or they become
Mhm.
discrete, new roles, but AI trainers, AI ethicists, people who are
Mhm.
specialized in workflow design, people who specialize in developing services as software, guidance based
Mhm.
on the changes that people need to have accompany this adoption. So that, from
Mhm.
a roles perspective, that's going to change. I think we'll see a bit of a wrestling around the skills requirements.
Mhm.
As the administrative jobs go to the AI assistants, what are the mechanism? The old mechanisms don't work for, at scale, at least, for being able to create, people who have the necessary capabilities. So
Mhm.
how are we going to start to enlist and think about enlisting, say, an AI tutor, an AI coach that can help you
Mhm.
not, you know, not just do the scut work that was where an entry level person would
Mhm.
start, but the more advanced contribution. Well, if you're a brand new worker, how are you going to know how to give advanced contribution? You've never been a
Mhm.
professional before in this context. You don't know the ropes in terms of the industry expertise. You've got an AI, implementation that's taking care of the repetitive workflows and tasks. You're going to monitor it. How will you know if you're doing a good job of monitoring it? Well,
Mhm.
enter then the AI coach. That starts to be something I imagine we're going to begin seeing a little bit more, whether it's
Mhm.
embedded or it's discrete, in the next 12 to 24 months. Um,
Mhm.
and then as we move forward, I think much of this will be absorbed, commoditized, will go from looking at working with the standardized systems, be they back end, be they front end, to much more of an AI platform approach,
Mhm.
and being able to develop skills in orchestrating the use of multiple agents from different vendors across
Mhm.
different contexts. And that might be something you're doing without even realizing it if you're a line of
Mhm.
business person who's just saying this is how the workflow works.
Mhm.
And which bot or agent is doing it is really completely invisible. Much in the same way today that we're all working, in the cloud, but we don't sit there and say, well, I've got an instance of
Sure.
AWS. You simply do your work, right? So
Mhm.
for those who are in non-developer IT roles, I think we're going to see sort of an absorption, if you will, of agentic AI into the flow of work, and the required skills are going to start to reflect that embedded within the roles and change that takes place, across those roles or to those roles, so that
Mhm.
by the next, I would say 2 years plus, this is going to simply be how we get our work done.
Mhm.
But our prediction from, an IDC standpoint is that this is really going to be disruptive to the ways in which people get their jobs done in the short term,
Mhm.
and really advantageous to new ways of working as the dust settles on what people who are not doing this kind of work wind up doing instead. And I think
Mhm.
that's the big, $64,000 question is, how will we, mitigate the interim
Yeah.
period where you have people who have not yet, gone to the next best step
Mhm.
within an agentic era, and those that have, sped ahead.
Definitely a difficult question. Well, thank you,
Mhm.
Amy. This was a very helpful conversation. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you check out the show and leave a review. It helps others discover the show and helps us improve the show. And if you have any questions, email me at gleb, Gleb, at disasteravoidanceexperts.com.